Hello and welcome to the webinar on permaculture on organic farms. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a very quick rundown on how today's webinar will work. The presentation will last about 45 minutes, and then after that, we'll have an additional 30 minutes for your questions. We'll be reading the questions out loud after the presentation is over, and we will answer as many as we have time for. Well, one of the most frequently requested topics by members of our webinar audience has been permaculture. So we are very excited today to be hosting this webinar by a team of graduate students from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Rafter, Sass, Ferguson, Kevin Wolz, and Ron Revord. You can contact them at the addresses on your screen and learn more about their work. Rafter can be contacted at his organization, which is liberationecology.org. And you can contact Ron and Kevin and learn more about their work at the Savannah Institute. So the address for that is on the screen. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our first presenter, who is Rafter Ferguson. So Rafter, you should now have control of the screen.
So hello, everyone. I'm Rafter. I'm a PhD candidate in crop sciences at the University of Illinois, and I'm working with Sarah Taylor Lovell in the multifunctional landscape analysis and design lab. And just a very brief bio of me. I got my master's in agroecology from University of Vermont in 2010. And I've been a student of permaculture since 2003. And I'm assuming that there's varying levels of familiarity with permaculture in the audience, and so this will be review for some folks, but just
muted.
For folks who just heard the term and aren't sure what it is, it's really a design system. And it often is associated with a set of practices like agroforestry. And there really is a sort of loose and evolving set of practices that are favored by folks in permaculture, but none of those actually originate from permaculture. They're all sort of adopted and adapted from other places. And at the heart of it, it's a whole systems design framework, a set of principles and strategies to design human-managed systems, and including farms, that work a little bit more like ecosystems, so that you get biological processes to do a little bit more of the work and thereby require less labor and less energy and energy-intensive inputs from people. And in addition to being a design system, it's also this international grassroots network with projects on every inhabited continent. And it was founded in 1978 by these two Australians, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison, and has spread pretty widely since then. This is just a little animation showing the international gatherings and convergences from the founding in 1978 until now. And it's a very grassroots network. There's no big institutions associated with it. But despite that, has spread pretty far and wide. Okay. Let's see. So well, the formatting of this is a little bit different from pardon me, from what I was expecting. But so permaculture has historically been associated with more sort of like home scale gardening sort of practices, more associated with horticulture. And that's never been necessary in terms of the framework. It's applicable to much broader scales, but it's taken a longer time to start influencing people who are working at a production scale. And that shift into farming and into more production scale operations has been happening over like the past 10 years, and seems like it's really starting to accelerate. And there's more and more of that influence showing up in farming systems. And so these are some of just the sort of essential elements of permaculture in terms of its relevance for farming. that distinguish it from other approaches like sort of traditional organics. And within the realm of practices and sort of favored practices, there's a lot of attention that's paid to perennial polyculture, so growing long-lived crops instead of crops that have to be replanted every year, and growing them in diverse mixtures. A lot of attention to sort of new developing and specialty crops from other parts of the world, and to implementing kind of integrated water management strategies over the entire farm landscape. And I'm gonna come back to each of these in a little bit more depth in just a bit. And in terms of the design system, sort of how do we think about creating a farming system? How do we think about designing a farm landscape? And one of the major emphases is in diversity, and in particular having diverse kinds of farm enterprises and diverse land uses, where we can not only have the resilience that comes from having many strategies instead of just one strategy, but also we can look for synergies between different businesses or between different land uses in order to sort of replace some of those inputs of labor and energy. And also approaching the creation of farming systems in a way that's very specific to the particular landscape that we're operating in, rather than dropping in a pre-existing template. And as we select land uses, so this term land use configuration I have down there at the bottom of design system, is one thing that really sets permaculture apart is the way that it very strategically and systematically approaches not just what land uses we select or what kind of enterprises we select, but how we arrange them in the landscape has a really significant impact on all different kinds of ecological and production functions. I discussed this at much more length in in a paper that's open access that was published last year called Permaculture for Agroecology. And if you just Google Permaculture for Agroecology in quotes, you'll get a link to that paper pretty easily. So there's a little bit of a lag between the association of permaculture with sort of gardening and hobby farming and the extent to which it's actually influencing production operations. And people understandably are skeptical on encountering it and thinking, oh, well, is anybody who's farming using permaculture in a practical way? How are permaculture farmers actually doing? And this is a map of 80 farms who identify themselves as being influenced by permaculture. This is who responded to a very a short survey that I ran in 2012 and 2013. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data from that survey just to address these overarching questions about is it showing up on farms and to what extent? And so let's see, that's a slide. And so in this chart here, there's a little bit of a lag, but hopefully it'll show up in just a sec. The chart that I'm about to show you is has acreage across the bottom and gross revenue up the side. Well, let's see. I'm showing this data to address some kind of the overarching questions of sort of, is this being applied in a practical way? So of these 80 farms who responded to the short survey, they're all represented here, and we've got the acreage and production on these farms and the gross revenue. And it's showing that certainly while there are a lot of very small scale farms in this sample, there's also some very large scale ones, and also some of the smaller farms are doing really well in terms of kind of economic scale. They're having a lot of gross income, and so permaculture is, to me, this is saying permaculture is clearly not just happening at a sort of hobby farming scale. There we go. And then this is showing gross revenue across the bottom, and then the number of enterprises on the y-axis there, up on the left-hand side. So diversification is this fundamental component of any kind of permaculture system. And we can also see that it's diversification is sort of the opposite of the trajectory that farming in the US has been on over the past 50 years. And so thinking about permaculture farms from a skeptical perspective, we might expect to see that, oh, maybe these farms are saying they're influenced by permaculture, but actually they're not really diversifying. And so maybe it's, just all talk. And what this is saying to me is, no, there's actually very high levels of diversification. And certainly there's some farms that aren't highly diversified, but there's that we might expect to see that as gross revenue goes up, that diversity kind of trails off and farms simplify as they get bigger. And we're also not seeing that. And if anything, we see sort of a convergence on kind of a median level of diversity, but
Muted.
we're still seeing a large number of enterprises, even on farms of in the $100,000 gross range and above. So for me, from this, as much as we can get out of this like sort of simple survey data, it's encouraging in terms of the question of permaculture being put into sort of practical use. But there's only so much that you can get from a survey like this, and so the next step is to visit farms. And so I visited over 40 permaculture identified operations in the continental U.S. last year, and this was all that travel was funded by a crowdfunding campaign. So thank you to all the funders, all 180 funders. And at these farms, I gathered a lot of socioeconomic data about quality of life. I mapped all the farms, and all that data I'm just analyzing now, and so I don't have concrete numbers to report from that yet. But I can use some of that to look back at some of these core elements and say, okay, are these things in practice? And so looking at perennial polycultures and finding that they are showing up on these farms, fairly extensively. On the bottom, we've got nut trees being planted into a rotational pasture at Good Life Farm in Interlaken, New York. And up above, we've got an olive grove that's over 100 years old in Oroville, California at Chaffin Orchards. And that olive grove is also pasture for mixed species rotations. So definitely and that's the Chaffin Orchards has about 1,500 acres of orchard. So that's definitely that kind of diversification and integration is being practiced on a pretty large scale. And okay, great. Okay, so new crops. And if you just showed me this picture by itself, I would probably think it was in Southeast Asia somewhere. But nope, this terraced rice paddies are on a hillside in Teignmouth, Vermont, at Breezy Meadows Orchard. There's been a lot of work on cold hardy rice being done in Vermont, and more farmers are beginning to take this up. And permaculture farmers, unsurprisingly, seem especially attracted to exploring these new crops and new opportunities. Integrated water management. What I mean by that. These are some good examples. At the bottom, we see raised beds on contour and alternating bands of annuals and perennials, plus drip irrigation. So we've got sort of multiple strategies of water management being all used at the same time. And in this context, these are obviously plantings that are worked at least in part by hand labor. And then up top, we see a system that's still pretty new and maturing. We see tall berms that are being used both for water control and also a windbreak, because this is in high desert in Montana at Cloud 9 Farm. And these tall berms were established specifically to have enough space in between to drive a tractor, although it's not being cultivated yet because the system's just that part of the system is just getting established. And then looking at this question of, how do we make diversification work? And we make it work by looking for synergies between diverse components. So at the bottom, what we actually in both pictures, there's this great example of a synergy that I've seen in a lot of these farms, and it's in the way that farmers are using animals to manage or to transition landscapes from one state to another. So on the bottom, there's a sow in this forest understory that's helping reclaim what at one point was an open pasture and then was abandoned and went through succession into a young forest. and that they're using that sow along with goats to transition some of this abandoned pasture into a shady understory silvopasture type system. And I saw this on animals being used in this way at a bunch of farms. And this is also at Breezy Meadows in Vermont. And on top, back at Chaffin Orchards, they're using goats to help manage the olive grove in addition to being, a crop themselves. So the goats climb right up into the olive trees and eat tender water sprouts. And apparently, I think, and it has to do with the timing of the rotation, they don't move on to eating the older material and sort of, defoliating the olive trees. So by moving goats through their olive blocks with the correct timing, they save a tremendous amount of harvest labor just through the process of, not harvest labor, a tremendous amount of pruning labor over their 1,300 acres of olives. So very smart, strategic integration. And at the heart of this design process is this idea that we carefully observe a landscape before we make irreversible land use decisions, or land use decisions that are difficult to reverse or that lock us into a particular business model. Instead of sort of dominant mode today of dropping in a kind of cookie cutter farm template, we watch the land over time and we look for how the land changes from one end to the other, and figuring out, okay, what's going to work in all these different patches of this landscape. And with the configuration question is that it's not just what land uses you select. You can make great choices about what land uses and what enterprises you involve in your farm, but it's also how you specifically arrange them in the landscape that are going to drive things like labor efficiency, that are going to drive things like the sort of beneficial synergies that you're looking for. You've got to strategically configure all these land uses to get the most bang for your buck and to minimize labor and inputs. And that's something that really the sort of set of kind of strategies and tools that permaculture has about that spatial arrangement question are really distinctive and very helpful for thinking through that process. And of course, there's all these farms out there that are setting an amazing example of sort of like different strategic pathways forward into diversification and how you can use these ideas in permaculture. But there's some very significant challenges that remain. There are very few budgeting and planning tools that are available for diversified operations, and very few likewise that are available for perennial crops. And so when you get into a diverse operation that also involves perennials, the sort of decision and planning support that's available for that drops to almost nothing. In terms of what's available, certainly like what's available through extension and similar sources. There is sort of holistic management and other sources out there and workshops that you can take that maybe get into it in a little more depth and have some tools to offer, some resources. But it's compared to what's out there for conventional farming and for non-diversified farming, what we have available to us is very limited. Another challenge that's not unique to permaculture systems, but it's unique to anybody who wants to produce perennial crops, is the maturation time for perennials, because you have a certain number of years to bearing, and you've got to figure out a way to make the budget work when you don't have any income being produced, and you buy that patch for the first 3 to 5 years perhaps. And so you have got to think of a successional strategy where your yields will shift over time. And that kind of complexity is the very reason why there aren't yet a lot of budgeting and planning tools. Also, there's a labor-intensive learning curve for new farmers and for folks taking on new enterprises. It's easy to jump in and be like, well, I want to implement the full diversified system immediately. and then you're trying to learn, 4 to 5 different enterprises at once and how they interact with each other, which is probably too much for year one. And there's also, for a lot of the sort of perennial crops and specialty crops, there's just a scarcity of improved varieties. And so we're at the beginning of the curve for that process. And there's limited market access and processing infrastructure that's available for those crops. And those last two in particular are questions that Ron and Kevin are going to address. And so I look forward to your questions at the end. And thanks very much, and I will pass it along to Kevin now.
I think so. Well, so my name is Kevin Wolz. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Illinois as well, second-year PhD student. I didn't have an intro slide here, but I guess a little bit of background about me. I started kind of in this area more as a pure ecologist. I like to say I was in kind of the restoration community, all about restoring prairies and savannas, and really more on the kind of pure natural system side of things. And then I came down to the University of Illinois. For those of you who don't know, is kind of in the middle of the corn soy abyss here in central Illinois, and I quickly realized that restoration just doesn't really work very well down here when just the land itself costs $10,000, $12,000 an acre. It's very hard to rationalize taking even an acre out of production to anyone, whether it be private or public landowners. And so I realized that quickly we had to find some kind of middle ground system that could give us some of those restoration things we wanted, but do it in a way that wasn't sacrificing all the economic needs we needed out of the region as well. And so that's how I started figuring out what permaculture was, and diving into that whole movement. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, Rafter said permaculture is starting to creep into larger acre farms and really influence agriculture beyond the more gardening scale. And I'm going to tell you how permaculture is now reaching the halls of science, mainstream science, and hopefully soon policymakers, and just there's more kind of mainstream kind of awareness beyond just the people that are involved in starting it. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the framework of what research is happening right now in permaculture on large scales, the way we kind of think about that, just clue you in on what we have going here. So I'm going to start with just the way I think about it, at least, and the way I think some people are thinking about researching permaculture. I like to start with the extremes. So on the slide here we have an oak savanna, native oak savanna on the right, and on the left we have our favorite corn monoculture. And so fundamentally, permaculture lies somewhere in between these two systems. Permaculture is supposed to be producing food, like the system on the left does very well, and then also producing a lot of ecosystem services like the system on the right does very well. And so somewhere we're in the middle there, and we're trying to figure out where in the middle we lie and how much of those things we can produce. So when you combine those, you get this next image, which is a farm in, let me do that again here. There we go. This is a farm, a 100-acre farm called New Forest Farm in southwest Wisconsin. You can see right away that you have different species going on, different colors. So you start eliciting this kind of nature image in your head. Oh, this is nature. But then you also start seeing geometric shapes and lines and rows and some structure to it. So then your brain starts reacting as, oh wait, no, this is agriculture. And so this is just an example to kind of show you what this middle ground might look like between agriculture and natural systems. And so these are the kinds of systems that we're working with. And I'm going to show you now what this kind of looks like in graph form here, because I tend to think in graphs. So across the bottom we have our 3 different systems, our 2 extremes, corn, soybean for production and native ecosystem for ecosystem services, and then some multifunctional or permaculture system way on the right. And the y-axis is just utility generally to society. And there'll be 2 colors. Here we have production. So corn and soy is pretty much as good as you can get as far as calories per acre. I don't know of any crop that really will produce edible calories at more calories per acre than corn can do, so that's pretty incredible. But Obviously not so hot as far as ecosystem services goes. But then the native ecosystem is kind of the opposite. Not really producing a lot of calories. Maybe you could forage a couple mushrooms out of it. That's great. But really what it's the shining example of is all those ecosystem services we want. Pollinators, carbon cycling, water quality, all those great things. Now, a multifunctional system, by definition, is supposed to do both of these things fairly well. How tall these bars are is kind of arbitrary. That's part of the research we need to figure out is these permaculture systems that lie in the middle, how good can they get at some of these things? We shouldn't be able to hit all the ecosystem services a native system can, because by definition, we're not necessarily focusing on native crops. We have some food crops that we're including in there. So I think it's important to realize that the goal is not to maximize any one service, maximizing calorie production like corn does, or maximizing pollinators like a native system does. The goal is not to maximize. The goal in permaculture is this more systems perspective optimization. So if you take these two bars in that multifunctional system and stack them on top of each other, and you can kind of do the other ones in your head, they're pretty small, you quickly realize that even if we aren't the best at any single axis, then we can still over yield in a sense, or provide extra utility for society. So that's a very simple kind of two-parameter example, just to give you an idea of what the goal is. This is the same exact thing, but more this flower petal diagram. We have a lot more axes. So on the left, you have natural ecosystem. There's all kinds of great things, not so hot on production. The more yellow petal there is, the better that the system is at that. Intensive cropland, really great at production, not much else. And then of course, this some multifunctional system, I put permaculture here. Again, it's not maximum on any one of those axes, but if you add all those up, there's a lot more yellow there to go around. So that's fundamentally what we're trying to do here, is think of this as in a systems perspective, optimality, as opposed to just picking out our favorite parameter and maximizing. So our first attempt in the research world, at Illinois here at least, we created this research site we call the WPP research site. Woody Perennial Polyculture is what that stands for. We use that phrase because if you use the word permaculture, or even sometimes agroforestry here at Illinois, doors will close on you instantly and you will get thrown out of offices, and it's just not something that we do or think about. So we use this Woody Perennial Polyculture phrase because they're three scientifically definable words that you can't really argue with. And it's actually helped quite a bit getting us in the door to different professors and organizations to actually have a conversation. So this site is very simple, provides kind of a first pass at this. This at the time was the largest kind of permaculture site, university-backed permaculture research site that we knew of. Fully replicated, a randomized block design. We have two treatments only, though. That's kind of the limitation. We have the corn soy rotation here in this block you can see, and then in the foreground is a polyculture of 5 or 6 species of woody plants in an alley cropping system. And so this has really helped get our foot in the door in the research community, and also provide some basic data on what these systems can do, and also be a really great demonstration site to show people what these systems can actually look like on a larger scale. The basic paradigm we kind of take inspiration from in designing that system, and just generally in the Midwest, is this kind of savanna structure where you have multiple layers going on, rather than a prairie is all grass and a forest is all canopy trees. We have this savanna structure where we have a lot of different layers going on. And layering is a kind of a fundamental concept of permaculture as well, but in the Midwest we really take that to heart because a lot of the area here used to be oak savanna, and so we use that as an inspiration. I'm not going to go through all these next couple slides in detail. I put these on here so you can kind of read back through and look at the questions later, but just to give you a general idea of things we're measuring in these systems: biogeochemistry, so that's all the nutrient cycles. Are we sequestering carbon? Are we reducing nitrogen leakiness? What's going on with water in these systems? Ecology, biodiversity, whether that's soil microbes, bugs, birds, small mammals, anything like that. What's the timing, the phenology of all these systems, and are these systems more resilient to drought or to other environmental factors? There's a lot of other little questions in there you can go back and read. On the economic side, of course, we need yield. We need these systems to produce food, no matter how beautiful they can look and no matter how great they can make the soil. We really need that yield out of there, so we're tracking that. Of course, yield then translated into profitability, and then can we do all this with minimal inputs, or at what level of inputs is really efficient? All these are important questions that permaculture really needs to be answered if we want to bring this to policymakers, for example, bring this to the USDA, bring this to the NRCS to create new programs, and bring this to farmers and actually show them numbers of what this can do, rather than, here's some nice pictures of trees that we can inspire them with. On the agronomy side, how to best establish these systems. Establishment is especially critical in these kinds of systems because they're perennial systems. You only get one shot at it, and if you screw it up the first time, you're going to be living with that for quite a long time. So properly establishing the systems is really critical. And then maintenance over the long run. A lot of people advocate for minimal maintenance in these systems as part of the inspiration we take from ecosystems to, ecosystems don't need us hanging around pruning the oak trees and whatnot to keep them happy. Well, we could go that route, or we could go a more intensive route, but where along that spectrum is optimal, we don't know. And then, of course, harvesting and processing. Harvesting can become more complex in a system that is obviously more diverse. You have maybe some apple trees in the way while you're trying to harvest your raspberries or something like that. Those are things we need to work on. So you can look back at those questions as well. So university research is great, and that's really going to help answer and evaluate permaculture at large scales. However, really a lot needs to be happening on the farms. The farmers themselves are the ones that are really dealing with the management issues, the economic issues, and especially in diverse systems that we can't come up with a single replicated research site that's going to test every permutation of arrangement and spacing of trees and all these different species in these complex systems. So we really need to leverage the farms that are out there and help new farms get started that help us answer these questions as well. So the Savannah Institute is a nonprofit organization that I started with Ron and some other colleagues a couple years ago, and we work directly with these farmers. We help farmers get started, so we're empowering farmers to take that leap. A lot of these farmers have been wanting to do this for so long. You may be one of those farmers on this call and you didn't know who to talk to, or you had some ideas but you wanted to see if anyone else was doing it first. So we help make those connections, help get people off the ground. Once they have put trees in the ground, we help them be successful, whether that be economically or environmentally. We help connect them with people that can help them do that. We provide them with resources and just generally provide that support structure in a relatively new market. And then most importantly, I feel, is the documentation. So this is basically research. So over the last 30, 40 years since permaculture kind of started, not a lot has been documented in rigorous ways. We need statistics to be done on these farms. We need baseline samples. We need samples taken after a period of time. These are things that need to happen if we really want to start proving these systems as legitimate in different ways. So this is something that we do with our farmers. We do some things ourselves, and then we're working with universities to flesh out even further. Just to give you an idea where these farms are, we work solely in the Midwest, the Savannah Institute does, so this is biased towards that. These are farmers that we're working with in the Midwest. As Rafter showed, they are all over the country, but we focus on the Midwest right now. And just to give you a quick idea of what farmers are planting, clearly it's very diverse all over the place. This is the number of individuals of these different species that were planted over the last 2 years on farms that we work with. Again, not all permaculture farms in the Midwest, but just the farms that we're working with. But you can see some of these crops at the top of the list with these larger numbers: currants, hazelnuts, raspberries, chestnut, all really, we're finding them on every farm. People are really choosing to focus on these crops. So there's definitely markets out there for these already, but these systems are clearly going to be creating much more of a supply for these crops. And as a transition here to Ron, the two crops out of that long list that we focus on the most here in the Midwest, given our corn soy heritage, is chestnuts and hazelnuts. Chestnuts, in our minds, being corn on trees, and hazelnuts being soybean on trees. Chestnuts are essentially pure starch and functionally can replace corn. You can put them in the same processing plant that corn goes into with a few tweaks of the knobs, and out the other end you can still get baby diapers and paint and cattle feed and all these things we make out of corn. We're doing some of those experiments here at Illinois. Same thing with hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are essentially half oil and half protein, very similar to soybeans, and you can substitute that in for a lot of things that soy goes into. So from an industrial level, a functional level, we can still produce a lot of the industrial ingredients necessary that our society has come to depend on with these systems. It's not all about eating nuts and berries and getting everyone to really convert their diets. That's certainly a part of it, but theoretically everyone can be eating Doritos every day, but it's just made out of chestnut flour rather than out of corn. So that's something to think about as well, is that we don't have to sacrifice kind of the whole industrial system that we've built up in order to switch systems. We can still produce core industrial crops like this and use the same infrastructure we have and still get all those environmental benefits that a tree-based system like this would provide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ron, who's going to dive a little bit more into the actual crops that we're working on and what that entails.
All right, thanks guys. I'm going to keep my introduction short so that we don't cut too much into the question time. I already have gotten a few great questions via email, so I'm looking forward to the last 30 minutes of questions. So we'll continue off of Kevin's introduction to the hazelnut and chestnut by going into some depth on the current states of breeding and market development for these crops. There's quite a bit of activity in the Midwest and eastern U.S., which is where I'll focus most of the conversation. But it's also quite scattered, so I'll gloss over a lot of material, and if you have particular interest in any part, I encourage you to download the presentation from Elise's last email and access some of the links that I've included. There we go. So first, the chestnut. Much of the work being done on this crop is at the entities that you see on the slide. Michigan State University and University of Missouri do most of the cultivar development work. And there is some variability in their objectives based on the regional environmental stressors. If you want to learn more about cultivars, I would encourage going to either of their two websites. Penn State and North Carolina State are also good resources for some of the genetic side or understanding more about the diseases that are being bred or resistance is being bred for. And the same goes for the American Chestnut Foundation, though their objectives are not necessarily commercial orchard development, but more habitat regeneration, though there is some overlap with breeding objectives there. So presently, viable cultivars exist, and best management practices are well understood for this crop, but there's continued work for blight and root rot resistance. And at the University of Illinois, we'll start to develop more work on polyculture, as you may have guessed. Next is the hazelnut. Looks like we may be missing something here. Yep, I think we're missing. Okay, so the same holds true for the hazelnut in many regards, though it gets slightly more complicated as breeders pull on different species of hazelnut to develop cultivars. Most of the work is done by Oregon State University, Rutgers, and now it's growing through the UW Extension. The Arbor Day Foundation is also another key entity for cultivar generation. They're located in Nebraska, and together between the University of Nebraska, Oregon State, and Rutgers University, and the Arbor Day Foundation, there has been a consortium created called the Hybrid Hazelnut Consortium. And all of these entities have great websites, and they're great resources to draw upon. So if you have any further interests, I would suggest pursuing those avenues. As for the pictures we see, the different gene pools or species pools that breeders are typically drawing from are represented by the different pictures, and you could see, at least initially, how it could translate into many different aspects of production. As the top picture is more of an American architecture, American hazelnut architecture, you see shrubs, you see a lot of heterogeneity, which we'll talk about a little later, and in the upper right-hand corner, you could see some variability in nut size. The bottom picture is representative of the European hazelnut, and it's typically more tree production as opposed to shrub production, and you could see greater uniformity in the nuts. Global production of hazelnut is typically done with the lower type of plant. A third crop, and we'll talk about this the least, is the currant. There's commercially available cultivars. The U.S. has plenty of regions that would be suitable for the currant, and plant materials are broadly adapted to North America. But production is primarily done in Europe. Our group particularly likes the currant for its potential compatibility in planting with the hazelnut and chestnut. And we're missing some information in this slide too that didn't transfer. So the three boxes to your right were filled with different plant species that also could be suitable for this type of planting system depending on your goals, which could include the American plum, the pecan, the pawpaw, the hickory for your tree layers. So those would have been in the top box, the teal color. And you could, in the medium tree layer, have anything from the cherry to serviceberry, the American cranberry, or an apple. And in the bottom layer, or the shrub layer, elderberry or chokeberry would be suitable. And like I said, depending on your goal, you could interchange any of these species or even more. For commercial purposes, we're sticking with the three that have been introduced. So some detail on chestnuts in the U.S. So blight was introduced, the chestnut blight was introduced to the U.S. in 1904, and it spread quite rapidly over the next 2 decades in the green region that you see in the picture to your right. By 1930, the American chestnut went from being the dominant stand in that Appalachian region to barely being present at all. Right now, breeders are sourcing resistance from the Chinese chestnut species, and there are strategies to back cross resistance into the American chestnut. For more information, you could follow the back cross link to the American Chestnut Foundation website and find out how they're exactly doing that. To root rot, This is a disease that's been talked about secondary to chestnut blight, but in the southeast, and if you're planting in areas that could be sometimes saturated, it's equally important to consider. Much of the work is being done jointly by the American Chestnut Foundation, Clemson, and North Carolina State. They're generating pools of seedlings that are resistant to root rot and attempting to combine those traits with chestnut blight resistant accessions. And you could see in the pictures to the right how it does affect the plant and move systemically throughout the plant. It does not just affect root growth. And a last consideration, this is a picture of internal kernel breakdown. And this should not be mistaken as a fungal disease or a pathogen, but rather it is due to incompatible pollinizer selection. Sometimes when you have orchards that have multiple species pools in them, you can see internal kernel breakdown occur. In Michigan, there were orchards that reported a 30% loss of kernels because of this. So that is another consideration that researchers are trying to understand to a greater degree. Moving towards market challenges, I have some resources that I could point you towards. Right now, the U.S. chestnut industry is moving past infancy. So a majority of producers have been in the business less than 10 years. So trees are just now entering serious commercial productivity. Like Rafter did indicate, there can be a lag time. Around 1.5 million pounds of production was in the U.S. in 2011, and that is pretty stable from year to year and growing. Some summaries for how producers are getting chestnuts to market can be found in the following two links. The Wormand article discusses the state of chestnut production in the central U.S., and he concisely details topics spanning from the average price per kilogram of chestnuts to physical bottlenecks or challenges in the production system. So it's a great and quick introduction for those interested in learning more about applied chestnut production. More detail about chestnut markets can be found in the second article, which was developed by the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry. They get more in depth about the perception of chestnuts by the marketplace. A few other resources for the business side of chestnuts. The Chestnut Growers Incorporated is a producer-owned agricultural processing and marketing cooperative that's throughout the lower peninsula of Michigan. The picture to the right shows you where their growers are located, and they're pretty well scattered across the state. But surprisingly, they're very well coordinated, and they're growing at a steady rate. They're a great example for how to overcome from the ground up development challenges that small farmers in this kind of area typically face. They've successfully pooled together resources for processing, storage, and distribution that often serve as a limiting factor for producers adopting these kind of long-term perennial crops. And then the next two links can be found through the Michigan State resource pages, and they give good perspective on what the costs of chestnut farms and the associated management practices may be. They're a great place to start if you're seriously considering adopting chestnuts on your farm. And on to hazelnuts, and this is where my research has most specifically focused. So Eastern filbert blight, as many of you may have heard, has been the biggest limiting factor for cultivar development and subsequent adoption of hazelnuts in the eastern U.S. And generally, the landscape for hybrid hazelnuts is actually very similar to that of chestnuts. There's traction in certain regions of the U.S., so farmers are adopting it at some scale. And there's a significant degree of collaborative research efforts spanning from cultivar development to encouraging adoption at the farm level. The U.S. hazelnut industry has done rather well in the Northwest for decades. Expansion to the remainder of the U.S. does weigh on some of the breeding objectives. One of the challenges is that in the Midwest and Eastern U.S., the Eastern filbert blight maintains higher virulence or pathogenicity compared to the Northwest, where production is somewhat fluid. So in addition to that, we also have greater issues regarding winter hardiness. As we can see in the lower picture here, these are two hazelnut species that are native to North America. On the left is cornuta, and on the right is Americana. And this is where breeders are sourcing some of the traits that they need to expand production to this part of the country. The challenge is that both of these traits, EFB resistance and winter hardiness, are somewhat complex and take time to incorporate into the presently commercially viable cultivars of the Northwest. The last challenge for hazelnuts is trait uniformity and propagation. In the Northwest, tissue culture methodologies are currently available, and those cultures are provided to nurseries, and plants can, easily get established into commercial scale orchards, as you could see in the bottom. However, it doesn't seem as though some of those methodologies are transferring to the new plants being developed for other parts of the country, so namely the Midwest and Northeast. So what current plant providers are doing is they're generating plants from seed. So you can get hazelnuts. However, each of them are going to be, or they won't all be genetically identical. Typically, they come from a pool of improved parent plants, as you can see in the picture here, and they're grown out from seed in mounds and harvested after several years as bare rootstock and planted, as you see in the lower two pictures, as bare rootstock. This may be suitable for current or for certain objectives. However, depending on the market in which you want to take your hazelnut crop to, you may need to have the kernel trait uniformity of the Northwest. So there are several objectives that are similar to what's going on with chestnuts, with hazelnuts. Namely, the challenges, the chicken before the egg predicament. There are many incentives to try to get producers to plant hazelnuts, but there's some hesitation because markets are somewhat undefined. What the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative is doing right now is they've established the American Hazelnut Company, which is to serve as an aggregator for buying and processing and distributing hazelnuts. And so that's helping potential growers in the Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois area take the step of establishing plants. Another facility that's been put in was by Ferrero in Ontario. This facility is extremely large, but not necessarily specific to hazelnuts, though they're working with the University of Guelph and Dr. Adam Dale to educate growers in the region that you see on the picture to your lower right to plant hazelnuts and sell back to Ferrero. More information on that can be found at the lowest link here, the Ontario Hazelnut Association page. And here's some information on currents. Like I said before, cultivars are readily available, and commercial practices, best management practices are well understood. There's research going on and extension reports available through UW Extension at Bayfield regarding cultivar section for regions in central U.S. And there's also a broad spectrum of information in this regard available through the GRIN database, which is located at Oregon State University. And I think now we could transfer back to the whole group and maybe field some questions.
Unmuted.
Okay, thanks, Ron and Rafter and Kevin. We are going to extend the question time a little bit longer because presentation ran just a little over, so we want to have time for as many questions as possible. If you missed the very beginning of the presentation, you can use the question box on your screen to type in questions and hit return, and I know many of you have been already doing that, so we will get on the questions as soon as possible. Just before we do that, I wanted to mention that we recorded this presentation, and we will be posting the recording as well as the slide handout, and I'll also post some additional links because I know in that last PowerPoint there were some links and it didn't have the actual web address, so I'll make sure that I put those links on the webinar registration page at this second link on your screen within the coming day or two so that you can look up those if you would like to. I would like to encourage everyone to check out our archived webinars. We have quite a lot of other interesting webinars about organic farming research, and I'd also just like to ask people to respond to an email survey about the webinar, which you'll be receiving later today. So with that, let's move on to the questions. Let's see, we had a question at the beginning of the webinar about animals and how in permaculture design you can protect trees mixed in permanent pastures from compaction and becoming campsites by animals. So in other words, the pastures are rotational, but animals will sometimes seek out trees and camp out. Do they use fencing? Do they not care? Can you discuss maybe an example or two that might talk about that? Everybody can unmute. I think Ron and Rafter are still muted according to this.
There.
Okay, there we go.
Rafter, why don't you take that one?
Okay.
Oh, well, I don't. Specific questions of technique like this are going to vary really widely from practitioner to practitioner. There's definitely no official that I'm aware of. I don't think anyone's ever suggested that there's okay, this is the permaculture way to address this question. And so, what I imagine you would find is that, and to the degree that I've seen this, some folks will be using fencing, some folks won't care. I actually haven't heard this mentioned as a problem before, and so that probably has to do with why I haven't heard a lot of specific discussion in permaculture circles about how to address it.
Okay. I just wanted to also mention that one of the questioners put in a comment about how he'd like to recommend Mark Shepard's book, Restoration Agriculture, for anyone who is serious about starting a commercial permaculture farm. So thanks for that recommendation. Here is a question for Kevin regarding the caloric potential of permaculture restoration agriculture systems. Mark Shepard suggests that although individual crop yield will drop in a polyculture, the total caloric nutritional yield of the landscape will increase relative to a monoculture like corn. Your chart seemed to suggest that that is not the potential with these systems. Do you want to discuss what you meant by that?
Yeah, so the chart I showed, again, was just picking one metric. So if we pick calories per acre, calories is, I would say, unfortunately, kind of the metric of choice in academia because it's so easy to measure and so universal. But yes, I mean, as far as the actual caloric production, I think it would be pretty darn hard to beat corn, for example. Now, the easy way around this is to say, okay, well, only half of corn calories actually go to human food, so we can half that number for corn. But, again, if we're really talking about kind of total factor productivity or total system yield, I think you kind of have to keep all that in there. So I think in Mark's book he focused in on human food production given current industrial usage. But then, absolutely, from a nutritional perspective, yeah, I mean, diverse systems like this will blow any monoculture out of the water. Whether it's corn or hazelnuts, when you have a diverse set of species providing yield for you, you're going to really increase your nutritional yield because of all the variety you can have in there. So, from that perspective, and unfortunately, academia, there's not a lot of papers on that, and not a lot of people thinking about or coming up with great metrics for describing the nutritional productivity of an ag system. But yeah, from that perspective, absolutely, the diverse system, I'd say, would win every time, hands down.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question for you about the chart that you put of the different crops that the farmers that you've been working with have been growing, like currants, and there's a number next to that, next to the crop. And so does that mean the amount or the number of plants or the pounds, or couldn't you just say what that number meant?
That's the number of plants installed on farms working with us over the last 2 years.
Okay. We have a number of listeners from different areas. Like there's one here from Southwest Idaho with 12 inches of annual precipitation. And then we have another listener from California. And so is there a central place where people can go to get more information on permaculture in different areas around the country? Or can you maybe recommend some other resources for different regions?
I think by the silence, maybe there isn't necessarily a central location. How I've gone about learning about our specific biome was species specific, if that helps.
What do you mean by that, Ron?
So as I've tried to learn more about what we may be interested in researching, I've tried to learn more about individual species, such as the chestnut or the hazelnut, and move forward in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I think it is hard right now. There really isn't a central Permaculture Institute of North America or where we can go and have all the information out there. But also, some people might argue that wouldn't really be very helpful either, because by definition, permaculture is supposed to be site-specific, let alone region-specific or state-specific or anything like that. So it's really hard to perfect practices in one place and then try to translate them out to a totally another region. So it's going to be hard.
We should be clear, there is an organization called the Permaculture Institute of North America. and there's also Permaculture Research Institute US or something like. There's a few organizations, but they're all pretty small, and some of them are growing and doing new things, but there's nobody who's doing that kind of central consolidation of information. There is a group called Apios Institute that have been an online have a website where they're working specifically with people who are doing more sort of forest garden scale. So they're working with perennial polycultures and they're soliciting input. It's almost like a curated sort of wiki kind of style of their finding out what's working for different people in different locations and what things are growing well together. But it's definitely, as far as I know, they're not doing sort of that farm scale thing, which is that's just a critical gap that we need to start filling. There is an international listserv that's hosted through iBiblio, and if you were to Google international permaculture email list, you probably would find your way to it pretty fast. You can sign up for, and that's a pretty good place to bring questions about, okay, what's happening in this part of the world.
Okay, let's see. Do you have any work or experience in persuading birds and squirrels to leave some nuts and fruits for us? We have a wildlife. There is a wonderful wildlife damage prevention guide that was posted on eOrganic recently. While some of the questions are being answered, I'll try to find the link for that and put it up on the screen. But if anybody else has anything to say about that, go ahead.
I'd say the only surefire method to any kind of damage or anything like that is to just plant more. So the more you plant, then the more there will be for you. So that's why the larger scale production can really help out with that.
It seems like there may be a few people that follow Mark in the crowd. What I've heard him say, and this is more specific to his nut crops and maybe even just specific to hazelnuts, but harvesting slightly before they're fully ripe does tend to help. And Mark, as he is so tuned into his man-made ecosystem, he says as soon as he starts hearing the bluebirds chirping is when he knows he needs to quickly harvest his hazelnuts. So maybe that anecdote helps.
Okay. If we wanted to gather data from nearby farms, how do you achieve any kind of replication in systems that are geographically organized and not conducive to replication?
You don't. Is kind of the short answer. So that's definitely part of the problem of getting data off farms. But that's also not necessarily where their value comes in. So the university setting really helps with that replicated kind of research, and then the farms are out there as testing grounds because they produce all kinds of variability to then really see if what you come up with on your replicated trials is actually robust in all these different settings. So I think that's more where their value lies. But as far as still gleaning some stats out of that, I think that the best you can do is try to have some sort of control on each farm. So we try with the Savannah Institute to make sure that somewhere fairly close to the plots that people are putting in, there is, for example, a corn-soy rotation happening, whether it be on that same farmer's land or on the land across the street. And we try to leverage that as kind of a relatively more consistent control across all of the farms to pull out some of the variability from that.
Okay. Can you recommend any time scaling strategies for farms transitioning from organic to permaculture cultivation practices, specifically how to phase plan for income while waiting for older trees to reach production? And then also, this farmer is looking for recommendations for any organizations that might provide grants for farms integrating permaculture practices?
Well, the question of phasing things in over time. I mean, if you have an active production operation already, it's definitely you're in a much better position than if you're starting from scratch, because you can continue producing what you're currently producing, and I think it's just a matter of making making a spreadsheet and doing a cash flow analysis, or and getting help in doing that. I wouldn't want to try and do that by myself, and just seeing, okay, like as we're taking a little bit of land out of production and putting in perennials, what's the timeline to some cash flow starting from those, and how much are we losing in production in the meantime. And the thing with a lot of these is that you don't, if you do sort of an alley cropping approach, you can still leave much of your land in production while your perennials are maturing. And I think that's the strategy that a lot of folks are using, even when they're starting from scratch, is they're doing a lot of annual production and or animal production while their perennial systems are coming on.
Okay, I just shared a link in the chat box to a directory posted by a listener of the Permaculture Activist magazine, Permaculture Directory of North America. So thanks for that. And then also, someone said that Permaculture Voices will have a conference in San Diego in March 2015. So if anyone's interested, they can look for that. So yeah, several people shared the Permaculture Activist link, so thank you very much for sharing those. Let's see. Okay, getting to the questions here. This person's listening from France. They have agroforestry experimental plots with research questions about multi-criteria assessment tools. Do you have adapted tools to evaluate performance which should not be limited to yield and income only, but also to biodiversity, landscape, shadow working? Is there anything like that you know of?
Not necessarily readily developed that we have right now, that as far as at the experiments we have going here at Illinois, but I'm sure that kind of stuff is out there, and we are really trying to reach out to our friends in France, because we know there's been a lot of agroforestry research that's happened there, and sometimes partly because of language barriers, but also just because of the journals that we're each publishing in. We don't get a lot of sharing of knowledge that way, so we're really trying to open up that line of communication actually a lot with France in particular. So
maybe you can get in touch.
Yeah, please get in contact.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any figures on the price per pound of these trees? So this person says, I get that we can grow them, but who's actually making a profit?
Yeah, so with chestnuts, I included a couple links that could guide you to good information in that regard. I believe that it's still a young, developing market, so there's huge variability. I think the average for about both crops, but this is specific to chestnuts, was $3.50 a pound, ranging from 50 cents a pound to $7 a pound. But those kind of reports are out there. You could find a similar report for hazelnuts at midwesthazelnut.org. That's the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative's website.
Okay, we put some of those links in the chat box, and then we'll put the rest of them on the second link on your screen on the webinar registration page after the webinar, which will then become the recording page. So we'll do our best to get as many of those resources in Ron's presentation there as possible in the next day or two. So do you have any examples of grain cultivation being done in polyculture?
So maybe clarify that where there's different species of grain actually being cultivated together, or grain in between rows of trees.
Okay. He didn't specify in the question. If you want to elaborate, you can do that, but
So, well,
maybe.
yeah. So as far as different grain species in polyculture growing, whether there's trees or not in the picture, I'd say the best resource to look at would be the Land Institute. They're doing a lot of work on that. They're in Kansas. That's West Jackson. And then University of Minnesota has several people there doing a lot of research in diverse herbaceous systems. But as far as grains in between rows of trees and more kind of alley cropping system, I know that a lot of the agroforestry happening in France is focusing on grains as that alley crop. Here in the Midwest, we don't have as much of that just because we don't grow a lot of grains. At least in Illinois, we don't do much. It's corn or soy, and neither of those are very happy in the shade.
I have seen, and this was very recently, similar examples done in Oregon as producers are trying to establish new hazelnut orchards. So it kind of serves to address one of the previous questions about early revenue generation as well. So I know some people are doing it, but I don't think it's that abundant.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Can you discuss some of the salient features that distinguish permaculture principles from those founding sustainable agriculture and agroecology, which also both consider perennials, polyculture, and spatial diversity?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. I think of them as being complementary. I mean, certainly permaculture emphasizes perennials in a way that I don't see emphasized in sort of the literature on organic farming or on organic farms. And there's definitely a lot of overlap between permaculture and agroecology, and what I've but what neither agroecology nor permaculture have that I've seen is the degree of attention towards configuration, towards design. I've looked pretty hard at the agroecology literature and have not found much discussion about the way that how things are arranged in the farm landscape drives a lot of functions. It's sort of implicit in conversations about windbreaks and buffers and things like that, but this sort of overarching perspective that permaculture is bringing to it is I find to be pretty distinct. And there's also that's a conversation to fill an evening with. Also, is the relationship between those three.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Rafter mentioned a few organizations doing research at certain level. One was Atheos. Can you mention these again? And he's not so sure of the spelling of that. So can you just mention those one more time?
Sure. Let me make sure that I have it right before. I think it's I think Atheos is just atheos.org. Nope, that's not it. Atheos. Let me figure that out. Maybe take another question, and I'm going to Google around.
Sure.
Sure I have
Yeah,
those right.
and while he's doing that, I keep typing in resources that our very generous listeners keep sharing. So someone shared something about the Florida Permaculture Convergence being taking place on March 27th to 9th. So I just posted the link to that. Okay, this person has a 120 member family CSA farm, and she would like to expand our pick your own offerings for the members. Can you recommend, or have you seen, a perennial polyculture that would offer a variety of pick your own yields for a CSA? Have you experienced anything like that?
I've seen some of the farmers we work with that are going more the pick your own route. I guess the way I would suggest you think about it is to really think about the level of diversity that makes sense. And this applies to really, if you're thinking about implementing a permaculture system, depending on the markets you're shooting for, a level of diversity maybe too much or too little for that. So if you are trying to sell all your crops wholesale, you may not want to have 20 different species and 10 varieties of each species on your farm, because you need to provide a consistent product. Whereas if you're going the farmer's market route, then you may be, instead of wanting one big truckload going out, you're going to be having one basket load every week. So maybe you want 10 different varieties of any species you have, because that spreads it out a little bit more. And for pick your own, I'd say maybe you're kind of somewhere in the middle. So you have maybe 3 or 4 varieties, and you spread those out seasonally. So if you do raspberries, you have 4 varieties that are spaced well throughout the year, so that you can still have enough on any given day, so that you can have more than one person come out and pick, but you're not overwhelming yourself with 10 different varieties. So I guess just thinking about that as far as what level of diversity makes sense for your desired market, and how that may change in the long run, is something to think about for that kind of stuff.
Okay, we have several comments from people who are, I guess, their experiences with animals and trees. So one person wonders how, that goats eat tree bark and kill trees. So how do the olive farmers that you've visited prevent that? And then before you get to that, there's someone here that says he operates a food forest in southwest Colorado in the high desert, and he uses tree tubes with great success against animals and harsh climates. He also sells them if anyone's interested. We don't have the contact information for you there. And then also someone else says that she raises goats and sheep and has to fence the trees to protect them for their shade. So do you want to talk about the goats? Well, I guess how the olive trees are protected if they are.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I believe that it's due to the sort of rotational schedule. Like,
Oh, okay.
but that's pretty much speculation. I just know that, I mean, I saw some goats and trees, and so that was the explanation that was given to me. And what I imagine is it's sort of like with any other rotational grazing strategy, is that you move the animals through, so the goats are eating the sort of tender first year water sprouts, and then by the time they get through that, they're being moved on to another paddock, so they never do damage to the trees.
Okay. Do you know of any research being done at this level on farms or in academia on the West Coast, specifically in California? Do you know of any other institutions or areas where that's being done there?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
I mean, there is, but I should say that it would be remiss to not, as somebody else said earlier, kind of comparing permaculture and agroecology. There's a lot of research that's happening in terms of practice, in terms of specific practices, that's happening that's very compatible with everything that we're talking about here, but it's happening under the label of agroecology, or it's happening under the label of agroforestry. So at the practical level, there's no hard line like this is a agroecology practice and this is a permaculture practice. So a lot of the questions about practice could just as easily be directed to agroecology or to agroforestry. These things are not. None of this stuff are things that permaculture invented.
Yeah, it's not exclusive to permaculture. So. Okay. Someone else posted a link and said that, well, not a link, but apparently there's a Colorado permaculture convergence taking place on May 23rd, and for details you can search for the Facebook page about that. Someone else recommended bone salve for protecting trees from the Sepp Holzer book on permaculture, and someone else recommends miracle tubes for tree protection from deer pasture or protection from grazing. So thanks for those resources. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions here. Let's see. Okay. Let me just. Okay. We are young entrepreneurs, and permaculture spreads strong core values that maintain the life of our land. We're wondering what ways you're currently monetizing permaculture farms and principles. What ways can we connect to permaculturists such as yourselves to assist in fiscal promotion and general awareness?
That's a really good question. I know that there are a lot of farmers out there practicing permaculture that are certainly, especially in the early years, capitalizing on tours and workshops and kind of that whole realm of education. Especially if you are one of the first farms, in your region or in your area that are doing this. There's probably a lot more interest out there than is kind of apparent, and so I would imagine, just based on how the success people have had here in the Midwest, what the kinds of education that you could run on your farm. So certainly that's a route that is being exploited a lot. As far as best ways to go about it, I don't know.
Okay. I think this is going to have to be our last question. We'll do our best to post as many links from the webinar as possible on the webinar registration page, because I just feel like there's so many good ones that are being typed in by our participants here. But this person is studying agriculture at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, which is also a major corn and soy growing region. She finds it hard to engage, or I'm not sure who it is here, hard to engage any professors in discussion about anything like permaculture or organic production. Do you feel these practices are gaining respect and ground in the university system in North America, or does one drop everything and move to France? So what do you think about that?
I think the University of Guelph is actually doing quite a bit in the realm of polyculture research, and even specifically with hazelnuts, chestnuts, and currants. But the reason it may be hidden is I think that they are pursuing it from a commercial aspect. But I think that there is a decent amount going on in the area around Ontario.
Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would just say that it's definitely gaining ground, and there's permaculture design courses being taught in more and more universities every year. A colleague of mine, Steve Gabriel, is teaching one at Cornell as of last year. There's there's a lot of sort of bottom-up student-led pressure, and so more and more that's happening. But it's also it was, science advances one funeral at a time, is how it's been said. It's like big ships turn slow, maybe is a slightly less kind of dark humor way to say that. So there's a lot of folks who are in the universities who've made their whole career around research on a particular style of agriculture, and it's hard. It's hard to change big institutions, but it's definitely happening, and pressure from the students as well as from kind of like international scientific community is really facilitating that.
One little tidbit I could say of advice on that is don't start with the agronomists or the agricultural researchers or the crop scientists. Start with the ecologists. They typically are working a lot more in this area, or they may not realize their research is applicable to agriculture, but when I was talking to people here at Illinois, I had an ecologist professor tell me that he had been waiting for a long time for us farmers to realize that ecology was a solution to all our problems. And, he had just been, sitting there doing his research, but not really engaging with the crop science community, partly because of the silos that exist in academia. But I was just starting with the ecologists, and then maybe moving on to the forestry area. Actually, most of the polyculture research done with trees has been done from a wood production perspective, so they may at least be aware of that literature. And then eventually, when you have a team behind you, then go talk to the ag people.
Well, thanks for that advice. We are running out of time, so I'd like to thank everyone for your questions and the many resources that you sent in. And I just want to say once again that you can find this and many of our upcoming and archived webinars on organic farming and research topics at the link on your screen. And we would also very much appreciate it if you could fill out the follow-up survey that you'll be receiving in an email later today. So thank you, Rafter, Ron, and Kevin, for presenting this research and talking about your work. And thanks to everyone for joining us.